Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, before the president departed for the Middle East for his trip, there was a White House briefing where National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan kind of dropped an interesting tidbit and then ran off to the Middle East. What did he have to say? What was this revelation?
So, as you mentioned, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in front of the White House press corps, very casually let the White House press corps know that Iran is intending to sell UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles to Russia as they are depleting their own stocks of all weaponry as their ongoing war in Ukraine continues into almost completing its fifth month. And so he didn't have many details to provide to reporters and didn't take questions, but the few details he did release is that the number of UAVs Iran is considering providing is in the thousands. Not only that, he also mentioned that the training, he said, would start in the beginning of July, and as you know, that's where we are right now in the month. So based on their intelligence, they believe that the training on these weapons could start as soon as today if it hasn't started already.
So these are essentially Iranian drones for Russia to use in their war against Ukraine.
Yes, and so a big part of this is, as we know, Russia has really been ostracized on the internet from the international community.
Right.
Almost, we've seen NATO become an even stronger, more powerful alliance. We've seen the U.S. lead that charge. We've seen countries not in NATO provide weapons and support for Ukraine. And we really have seen Russia get ostracized on this scale, and now they found a lifeline in Iran, another country that is in familiar territory of being sort of on the outskirts of the international community. And it does bring questions as to how this affects other aspects of foreign policy, like the president's intentions to get back into the Iran nuclear deal.
So we're in the midst of renegotiating the Iran nuclear deal, or a re-entry potentially of the United States into this framework that was initially adopted in 2015. There's been some language that's been agreed to, but apparently not conclusively so on the Iranians' part. Russia is also a part of these negotiations, so it does seem to really complicate things on multiple fronts, doesn't it?
It does, and yet the Biden administration, even as they were announcing that Iran was selling these drones, maintains that there's a deal to be had here. They really believe that they have staked a lot of effort into trying to get this deal done, and we saw John Kirby, formerly of the Pentagon and now of the National Security Council, say earlier this week in discussing both the drones as well as the Iran nuclear deal, that a deal is still on the table as we speak. Iran has to come to the table and accept it, but it's there. It's been offered, and so it doesn't really seem like what's happening in Ukraine would have an effect on a possible re-entry into the deal.
So the White House clearly wants there to be an Iran nuclear deal, and they want a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear program. But in Israel, President Biden did say that he's open to the use of military force as a last resort if it would stop Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon.
That's exactly right. And so a big part of President Biden's trip to the Middle East is how he'll handle Iran. It's questions about getting back into the nuclear agreement. We've heard even from the IAEA that this is really, not looking. No one's looking optimistic about this.
Right.
They've gone as far to say Iranian actions recently in regards to the nuclear program have dealt a near fatal blow to these conversations.
Right.
And yet the administration still believes there's a deal to be had here. But we don't really know the path forward to getting there.
I mean, there does seem to be a lot of bipartisan skepticism about these negotiations in Congress, including from Senator Bob Menendez, the New Jersey Democrat who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. At the same time, the Biden administration has looked at Iranian nuclear progress and has generally blamed the Trump administration for leaving the deal in the first place for those things happening.
That's exactly right. And it's important to remember the U.S. entered the agreement under the Obama administration in 2015, and Trump pulled out 3 years later, calling it the worst deal ever. And as Iran's nuclear program has progressed, the current administration has blamed it on, as you said, the previous administration for pulling out of the deal.
a frequently recurring theme in this administration. So talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine. What is Russia's progress? What is the status of the invasion at present?
So as you know, there are many different sort of battlefields where the war is going on. It's predominantly occurring in the eastern part of Ukraine, where Russia continues to pound Ukraine, and they keep making progress, even though it's very slow and incremental. They continue to make progress in part because they just outman and outgun the Ukrainians. Away from that sort of battlefield where it's sort of very intense on the ground fighting, Russia continues to bombard various parts of Ukraine through missile strikes. And so we saw, as recently as earlier today, a strike in the center of Kyiv, in the center of Ukraine,
Right.
Close to Kyiv, hit a residential building and killed 20 people. We saw a similar strike in another part of the country a couple days ago. And so in addition to the war that's going on the battlefield in the east, we're seeing strikes hit civilian targets and kill civilians all throughout the country on a not quite daily basis, but on multiple times a week.
So we're hearing a lot of talk about war crimes, not just in relation to the strikes, although those are often so described, but also with deportations of Ukrainians, with detentions of Ukrainians. Talk a little bit about what we're hearing in that area.
So this isn't necessarily a new concept, but it's new in regards to that earlier this week, Secretary Blinken referred to the deportations and detentions of Ukrainians as a war crime itself. And so the State Department, the administration, various Western countries have all used the word war crime to describe various actions, but they're not quite as simple as that. And so it is interesting to see, as the war progresses, more and more of these strikes being considered war crimes, being called out as war crimes by Western leaders.
And they're estimating a fairly large number of Ukrainians have either been deported from the country or have been detained by the Russians.
Yeah, so it's hard to figure out exactly how many people, given how difficult it is tracking these types of things, especially on the ground in a war zone. But Secretary Blinken said, citing his own sources, that anywhere between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians have been deported or detained, and within that category, or that group, said about 250,000 of them were children.
That's terrible numbers. Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.